Hey there, night owls and history lovers. Tonight we're diving into something that'll make your medieval content look like a children's bedtime story. So get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, and let me tell you about a man whose body was so rotted by syphilis that his skin wept pus through silk papal robes, whose breath reeked of decay and wine, and who turned the Vatican into his personal brothel while openly having sexual encounters with his daughter in rooms where saints once prayed. We're talking about Pope Alexander VI. And trust me, you think you've heard bad stories about religious leaders? You haven't heard anything yet. Picture this. It's October 30th, 1501. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the supposed holiest place on earth, naked courtesans are crawling on their hands and knees across marble floors slippery with bodily fluids, competing to collect chestnuts with their mouths, while cardinals, men who've taken sacred vows of celibacy, pleasuring themselves openly and cheering them on. The Pope himself is sitting on his throne, robes hiked up around his waist, stroking his diseased member, while taking detailed notes on which concubine performs best so he can award sexual prizes to the clergy who fornicate most enthusiastically. This actually happened. This is documented history, recorded by the papal master of ceremonies in diaries that the Vatican tried to destroy for 500 years. But that's just Tuesday night entertainment under Alexander VI. Because what happened inside those Vatican walls between 1492 and 1503 was so depraved, so utterly twisted, that it makes modern scandals look like innocent misunderstandings. We're talking about a pope who poisoned his enemies with the same hands he used to bless communion wafers, who sold salvation like a street vendor while committing sins that would make Satan himself vomit, who created a family business built on murder, incest and corruption so systemic that it poisoned the Catholic Church for centuries. Welcome to the reign of Alexander VI, where the line between holy and hellish didn't just blur, it was obliterated by a man whose very presence seemed to make the crucifixes weep blood. Let's start with a question that should chill you to the bone. What happens when the most powerful religious institution in the world becomes a crime family? What happens when the man who claims to speak for God on earth cares more about his own pleasure than anyone's salvation? You're about to find out, but first you need to understand something about the Renaissance Catholic Church. By the late 1400s, the Vatican wasn't just spiritually corrupt, it was practically a mafia operation with holy water. Cardinals bought their positions like stock portfolios, bishops sold indulgences like carnival tickets to heaven, and the Pope, well, the Pope was supposed to be celibate, devoted only to God and the Church. Rodrigo Borgia had other plans. Born in 1431 in Xàtiva, Spain, Rodrigo wasn't destined for greatness. He bought it. His uncle, Pope Calixtus III, handed him a cardinal's hat when he was just 25 years old. No theological training required, no spiritual calling necessary, just family connections and cold hard cash. Even then, whispers followed him through the Vatican corridors like smoke. Young Cardinal Borgia had appetites, dangerous appetites. He hosted parties that made Roman orgies look like church picnics. He collected mistresses like other men collected coins. And he sired children, lots of children, in direct violation of his sacred vows. But here's what's truly terrifying. Nobody stopped him. Because in Renaissance Rome, money talked louder than God. For over 30 years, Rodrigo played the long game. He accumulated wealth, blackmail material, and political allies while perfecting the art of looking holy in public and being utterly depraved in private. He learned that in a corrupt system, the most corrupt man doesn't get punished. He gets promoted. And in 1492, the same year Columbus reached America, Rodrigo Borgia reached the ultimate prize, the papacy itself. But how does a man known throughout Rome for his sexual scandals and financial corruption become pope? The answer is simple, and it should make your skin crawl. He He bought it. August 1492. Pope Innocent VIII was dead, and the College of Cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel for one of the most corrupt papal elections in history. Forget prayer and divine guidance. This was an auction, and Rodrigo Borgia was the highest bidder. Envision the scene. 23 of the most powerful men in Christendom, locked in a chapel, ostensibly seeking God's will. But outside that sacred space, Borgia's agents moved like shadows through Rome streets, carrying chests of gold, deeds to properties, and promises of wealth beyond imagination. Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, one of Borgia's main rivals, walked away with 4 mule loads of silver and the lucrative position of vice-chancellor. Cardinal Orsini received castles and cities. Even the austere Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, later Pope Julius II, was offered a fortune, though he refused it, sensing the darkness that would follow. When the votes were counted, Rodrigo Borgia had won, but as the white smoke rose from the Sistine Chapel, signalling the election of a new pope, something else was rising too, the stench of corruption that would define the next 11 years. The newly crowned Alexander VI, he chose the name to honour Alexander the Great, wasted no time revealing his true nature. Within days of his coronation, his mistress Giulia Farnese, a 19-year-old married woman known throughout Rome as the Pope's whore, was back in his bed. His children by previous mistresses were elevated to positions of power. His illegitimate son, Cesare, was made Archbishop of Valencia at age 17. But if you think that was shocking, you haven't heard anything yet. Because Alexander VI wasn't content to simply break his vows in private. He was going to transform the Vatican itself into a playground for his perversions. And he was going to do it in plain sight of the entire Christian world. The papal apartments, once sanctified spaces for prayer and contemplation, became something else entirely. Frescoes of naked gods and goddesses replaced religious imagery. The Pope's private chambers were furnished with silk-draped beds and mirrors, positioned for optimal viewing of activities. Even the papal wardrobe changed. Gone were the simple white robes of humility, replaced with cloth of gold vestments, dripping with jewels and designed to impress rather than inspire. But the real transformation was just beginning. Because Alexander VI had bigger plans than simply enjoying his newfound power. He was going to turn the papacy into a family business, with his children as his partners in crime. And at the centre of it all would be his favourite son, Cesare Borgia, a young man whose appetite for violence and pleasure would make even his father seem restrained. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would span over a decade and leave blood on the altar of St. Peter's itself. If you thought having one corrupt pope was bad, imagine a pope who turns the Vatican into a criminal enterprise where his illegitimate children torture victims in rooms that smell like rotting flesh and stale semen, where murder is discussed over breakfast, like planning a grocery list, and where the papal dining room is redesigned with special drainage to handle all the blood. Let's meet the family, and I use that term loosely, because what the Borgias had was less a family than a pack of psychopaths united by shared DNA and mutual blackmail. First there's Cesare Borgia, Alexander's favourite son, and the inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince. Picture a man so beautiful that grown women would weep just looking at him, but whose eyes held the dead, empty stare of a shark. He was a sociopath wrapped in silk and charm, who discovered early that his face could get him into any bedroom, and his willingness to torture could get him out of any political problem. Cesare didn't just kill people, he experimented on them. His private chambers beneath the Vatican included a collection of torture devices that would have impressed professional inquisitors. Iron maidens lined with spikes positioned to pierce but not kill immediately. Pulleys designed to slowly dislocate joints over hours. Heated brands shaped like religious symbols, that he used to mark his victims' faces before releasing them as living warnings, but his real talent was psychological torture. When the young Lord of Camerino opposed Cesare's land grab, Cesare didn't just kill him, he forced the man to watch while his two brothers were slowly strangled with silk cords. Then he assaulted the Lord's wife in front of him, before finally ending his suffering with a blade to the throat. The message was clear: oppose the Borgias and everyone you love dies screaming. Then there's Lucrezia Borgia, who needs her own trigger warning. Beautiful, intelligent, and so psychologically damaged by her father's sexual abuse that she developed a split personality, the public face of Renaissance nobility and the private reality of a woman who helped plan murders while being repeatedly impregnated by her own father. Don't mistake her for a victim, though. By her 20s, Lucrezia had become an active participant in the family business. She specialised in poison delivery, using her feminine wiles to get close to targets her father and brother couldn't reach directly. Her signature method was the kiss of death, literally coating her lips with toxins that would absorb through skin contact. She killed at least 3 men this way, smiling sweetly as they collapsed with convulsions. But perhaps most disturbing was how she used her own sexual abuse as a weapon. When political negotiations stalled, Lucrezia would seduce male opponents and then threaten to accuse them of sexual assault. Devastating in an era where a woman's word could destroy a man's reputation, she had perfected the art of being both predator and prey, victim and victimizer, sometimes within the same conversation. Juan Borgia, the Duke of Gandia, was the family's military leader until his brothers got tired of his incompetence and had him murdered. But before his death, Juan earned a reputation for cruelty that shocked even his relatives. During his brief military campaigns, he pioneered techniques of psychological warfare that involved deliberate desecration of religious sites and torture of prisoners in ways specifically designed to break their faith. Juan's specialty was forcing captured priests to commit blasphemous acts before killing them. He would make them urinate on crucifixes, perform mock masses using excrement as communion wafers, and exploit their own altar boys while he watched and took notes. The goal wasn't just to win battles, it was to destroy the enemy's spiritual foundation so completely that surrender became preferable to resistance. And presiding over this carnival of depravity was Alexander VI himself, a man who had turned the papal apartments into a combination brothel, torture chamber, and planning centre for continental-scale criminal enterprises. The Pope's daily routine would have made a Roman emperor vomit. He rose late, usually around noon, because his nights were spent in activities that left him exhausted and often covered in other people's bodily fluids. His morning audiences weren't diplomatic meetings, they were auditions. Supplicants didn't just bring petitions, they brought daughters, wives, sisters, all offered as sexual tribute to ensure papal favour. Alexander kept detailed records of these encounters, rating women's performance and cataloguing their sexual preferences for future reference. The papal library contained shelves of what were essentially pornographic diaries written in the Pope's own hand, describing his conquests in language so explicit that even trained historians have difficulty reading them without becoming physically ill. But the true horror wasn't the sex, it was how seamlessly it integrated with the violence. Alexander would often move directly from ravishment to murder planning without changing clothes or washing his hands. Witnesses describe him receiving oral sex from terrified young women while simultaneously dictating assassination orders to his secretaries. The papal dining room was redesigned with practical considerations for this lifestyle. Special tiles were installed that could be easily cleaned of bloodstains. Drainage systems were added to handle the aftermath of torture sessions. Even the furniture was chosen for dual purposes: ornate chairs that could double as restraining devices, decorative tables with hidden compartments for weapons and poisons. By 1500, the Vatican had become a machine designed to generate wealth through any means necessary. Church funds were diverted to pay for assassinations. Sacred relics were pawned to finance orgies. The sale of indulgences became an industrial operation, with salvation literally priced by the sin and payment plans available for bulk purchases of forgiveness. And through it all, the Borgia family maintained their public facade of pious devotion. They attended Mass daily, blessed the faithful with the same hands they used to strangle enemies, and spoke eloquently about Christian virtues while privately worshipping what could only be described as the antithesis of everything Christ represented. The psychological compartmentalization required for this level of hypocrisy created individuals who were essentially human monsters, beings who looked like people but had abandoned every trace of normal human morality. They weren't just criminals who happened to run the church, they were something much worse, people who had successfully convinced themselves that their evil was actually divine will. And the most terrifying part? It worked. For over a decade, this system of institutionalized depravity functioned smoothly, generating enormous wealth and power, while maintaining enough public legitimacy to keep the Catholic faithful in line. The Borgias had proven that with enough charm, enough violence, and enough willingness to abandon every moral principle, even the most sacred institutions could be turned into criminal enterprises. They had weaponized hypocrisy itself, turning religious authority into a tool for exploitation and abuse. It was a lesson that would echo through history, a template for corruption that ambitious psychopaths would study and emulate for centuries to come. The Borgias hadn't just perverted the papacy, they had created a new form of evil, one that could hide behind any institution, any ideology, any claim to moral authority. And once that box was opened, it could never be closed again. October 30th, 1501. Close your eyes and imagine this. You're standing in the most sacred building in Christendom, where saints are supposed to walk on marble, sanctified by centuries of prayer. But instead of hymns, you hear the wet sounds of bodies slapping against stone. Instead of incense, you smell sweat, wine, and the musky stench of mass fornication. And presiding over it all, wearing the robes of Christ's representative on earth, is a 70-year-old man masturbating while taking detailed notes on which prostitute performs best. This isn't fiction. This is documented history. Johannes Burchard wrote it all down, because that was his job, to record papal activities for posterity. What he witnessed that October night was so depraved that even he, a man accustomed to Vatican corruption, could barely bring himself to describe it in full. But what he did record makes your skin crawl. 50 prostitutes, not just any women, these were Rome's most expensive courtesans, their bodies perfumed and oiled like sacrificial offerings. They arrived at the papal apartments dressed in silk that cost more than a peasant family's lifetime earnings. But by the end of the evening, that silk would be soaked with bodily fluids and scattered across marble floors like discarded altar cloths. The dinner was a performance in itself. Cardinals fed the women by hand, letting wine and oyster juice drip down their chins and necks before licking it off with tongues that had blessed communion wafers hours earlier. Bishops cupped breast and buttocks while discussing theology. The air grew thick with the sounds of wet kissing and the rustle of fabric being pushed aside. But when the meal ended, the real horror began. Imagine this scene, because Burchard forces us to. Servants scattered hundreds of chestnuts across the cold marble floor of the papal reception hall. Then, and I need you to really visualize this, 50 naked women dropped to their hands and knees and began crawling around like animals, collecting the nuts in their mouths. Not their hands, their mouths. The cardinals formed a circle around them, shouting encouragement and placing bets. The blonde one near the altar. No, the brunette by the window. Their voices echoed off painted ceilings, where angels and saints gazed down at the spectacle with golden eyes that seemed to weep. Alexander VI sat on his papal throne, the same throne where he pronounced doctrine and blessed the faithful, stroking himself through his robes while keeping score. 47 chestnuts, he called out when one woman finished. Can anyone do better? He wasn't just watching, he was orchestrating, conducting this symphony of sacrilege like a maestro. But the chestnut game was foreplay. What happened next makes your stomach turn. The crawling women were divided into groups, and the clergy were invited to make their selections. Cardinals who had taken sacred vows of celibacy began stripping off their vestments, their pale, soft bodies gleaming with sweat as they prepared for what Burchard described as the competition. The goal was simple: see who could achieve climax the most times in a single evening. Prizes were awarded, not just money, but church benefices, holy relics, even positions of ecclesiastical authority. They were literally fucking for God's power. And the sounds. Burchard describes the echoes: grunting, moaning, the slap of flesh against flesh, the wet squelching of penetration, all accompanied by laughter and cheering. Imagine those sounds, bouncing off frescoed walls, past crucifixes and religious artefacts, while the Pope himself masturbated to completion and called for servants to clean him with altar cloths. The marble floors became slippery with semen, vaginal fluids, and spilled wine. Women who had been elegant courtesans hours earlier were now being mounted like animals, their faces pressed against cold stone while cardinals thrust into them from behind. Some clergy coupled with multiple women simultaneously, their bodies forming writhing piles of flesh beneath paintings of the Virgin Mary. But here's what makes it even worse. Lucrezia Borgia was there, the Pope's own daughter, sitting in a chair positioned for optimal viewing, watching her father masturbate while clergy violated women mere feet from where she sat. Some accounts suggest she didn't just watch, that she participated in judging the competitions and even suggested new positions and configurations. Visualize a 21-year-old woman, supposedly virtuous, supposedly pious, calmly observing, while her father ejaculated onto the floor of the papal apartments, and then called for more wine to keep the festivities going. What kind of family dynamic creates that level of normalized sexual deviance? The evening lasted until dawn. By the time it ended, the sacred spaces of the Vatican reeked of sex and wine. Altar cloths were stained with bodily fluids. Religious artifacts had been knocked over during the frenzied coupling. And in the papal bedchamber, Alexander VI fell asleep, surrounded by exhausted prostitutes, while Lucrezia retired to her own quarters as if nothing unusual had happened. The clean-up took 3 days. Servants had to scrub marble floors with lye to remove the stench. Tapestries were burned because the smells couldn't be removed. Even then, visitors to the papal apartments reported detecting lingering odours of musk and corruption for weeks afterward. And this was just one night. Burchard's records show similar events happening regularly, sometimes weekly, throughout Alexander's reign. The Vatican had become a brothel, with the Pope as its primary customer, and his family as willing accomplices in turning Christ's house into a temple of depravity. Okay, lean in close, because what I'm about to tell you is so twisted that historians still whisper about it in academic conferences, looking over their shoulders like they're sharing state secrets. This is the part where even I have to pause and ask myself if you're really ready to hear this. Because once you know what happened between Alexander VI and his daughter Lucrezia, you can never unknow it. Visualize this. It's 1497 and Giovanni Sforza, Lucrezia's first husband, is fleeing Rome like his life depends on it. Because it does. He's just witnessed something so fundamentally wrong that speaking about it could get him killed, but staying silent might destroy his soul. So he writes to his allies, his hand probably shaking as he forms the words, His Holiness wishes to sleep with his daughter himself. Not political alliance, not strategic marriage, sleep with, as in fuck, his own daughter. But here's what makes your skin crawl. Instead of denying it, Alexander's response was to have Sforza hunted down like a dog. No, how dare you spread such lies? No righteous indignation, just cold, calculating destruction of anyone who spoke the truth. Because that's what guilty people do. They eliminate witnesses. The servants saw everything, and I mean everything. They describe watching through keyholes as Alexander would summon Lucrezia to his private chambers after evening prayers. The sounds that came from those rooms, Jesus, moaning, rhythmic thumping against walls, the wet, unmistakable sounds of penetration. And then Lucrezia's voice, sometimes crying, sometimes gasping with what could only be described as pleasure. One chambermaid, in a confession sealed for centuries, described finding the papal bed soaked with fluids and bloodstains. Not menstrual blood, the kind of blood that comes from violent penetration. She also found torn silk undergarments and what she described as seed stains on religious vestments that Alexander had worn during the encounters. But wait, it gets worse, because this wasn't physical assault, at least not entirely. Multiple witnesses describe seeing Lucrezia entering her father's chambers voluntarily, sometimes initiating the encounters herself. Palace guards reported her knocking on his door at night, dressed only in thin nightgowns that left nothing to imagination. They watched her kiss him goodbye after these visits. Not the kiss of a daughter, but the deep, tongue-probing kiss of a lover. Think about that. A 20-year-old woman, supposedly one of the most cultured ladies of Renaissance Europe, willingly engaging in sexual relations with her own father. What kind of grooming, what kind of psychological manipulation creates that level of normalized deviance? The pregnancies tell the whole story. Lucrezia gave birth at least 4 times during periods when she was living primarily in the Vatican, separated from her husbands. The timing is impossible to explain away. Conception, dates that coincide exactly with her father's visits, with his periods of intense prayer and meditation that required absolute privacy with his daughter. The Roman infant, born in 1498, is the smoking gun. 2 papal bulls, official church documents, were issued about this child's paternity. One claimed Cesare was the father. Another hinted that Alexander himself had sired the boy. Why would the Pope issue contradictory documents unless he was desperately trying to cover up the truth? And what truth could be so damaging that it required papal bulls to obscure it? But here's the detail that makes you want to vomit. Court physicians' records show that Lucrezia required medical treatment for vaginal tearing and internal injuries consistent with violent sexual activity during several of her Vatican residencies. These weren't the injuries of a woman engaging in normal sexual relations with age-appropriate partners. These were the wounds of someone being brutally penetrated by a much older, much larger man who didn't care about her comfort. The Venetian ambassador's dispatches are even more explicit. He describes walking in on what he thought was a father comforting his crying daughter, only to realise that Alexander's hands were inside Lucrezia's dress, fondling her breasts while she pressed against him with obvious arousal. The ambassador fled the room, but later wrote that the scene was burned into my memory like a brand, proof that Rome has become hell itself. Even more disturbing are the accounts of their public behaviour. During formal dinners, Lucrezia would sit on Alexander's lap, not beside him, on his lap, while he conducted church business. His hands would disappear beneath her skirts during conversations with cardinals. She would whisper in his ear and nibble on his earlobe while foreign ambassadors tried to maintain diplomatic composure. And the family knew. Cesare not only knew about the sexual relationship, he used it as political leverage. When he wanted favours from his father, he would threaten to reveal the truth about Lucrezia's pregnancies. When he wanted to control Lucrezia, he would threaten to tell their father that she was being unfaithful with other lovers. The incest wasn't just a family secret, it was a weapon they all used against each other. The most haunting evidence comes from Lucrezia's own later behaviour. After Alexander's death, she retreated into obsessive religious devotion that terrified everyone around her. She would pray for hours, tears streaming down her face, begging God's forgiveness for sins that have no name. She founded convents specifically for fallen women and spent fortunes on masses for the dead, specifically masses for her father's soul. When she finally confessed to her priest before dying, the man emerged from her chambers white as parchment, refusing to speak about what he'd heard. He only said that some acts stain the soul so deeply that even divine forgiveness may not suffice. What could she have told him? What memories haunted her so deeply that even the promise of heaven couldn't provide comfort? The truth that historians refuse to acknowledge is this: Alexander VI didn't just commit incest with his daughter. He created a sexual relationship so twisted, so psychologically damaging, that it destroyed both their souls. And the Catholic Church, the institution that claims moral authority over 1 billion people, was built on that foundation of sexual abuse and familial perversion. Sweet dreams. By 1503, Alexander VI had turned Rome into a charnel house disguised as the Holy City. But if you think the sexual depravity was the worst of it, you haven't heard about the murders. Because the Borgia family didn't just collect lovers and wealth, they collected corpses, and they did it with a precision that would have impressed professional assassins. The body count started early. In 1497, Juan Borgia, the Pope's own son, was found floating in the Tiber River with 9 stab wounds and his throat cut. Officially, he'd been killed by unknown assailants. Unofficially, everyone in Rome knew who had ordered the hit: his brother Cesare. Juan's murder wasn't passion or politics, it was a family clean-up operation. The Duke of Gandia had become a liability, his incompetence and brutality threatening the Borgia family's carefully constructed empire. More importantly, he was competing with Cesare for their father's affection and inheritance. In the Borgia family business, that was a capital offence. Alexander's reaction to his son's murder was telling. He wept publicly, ordered investigations, and vowed to reform the church in Juan's memory. But within weeks he was elevating Cesare to new heights of power and wealth. The message was clear. In the Borgia family, usefulness mattered more than blood. But Juan was just the beginning. Under Cesare's leadership, the Vatican became the headquarters for a murder-for-hire operation that targeted anyone who threatened Borgia interests. Cardinals who opposed Alexander's policies had a disturbing tendency to die suddenly of mysterious illnesses. Rival noble families found their heirs meeting with fatal accidents. Even foreign diplomats learned to sample their food carefully when dining at the papal court. The Borgias' weapon of choice was poison, and they elevated it to an art form. Cantarella, their signature blend, was nearly undetectable and could be adjusted for timing. Victims might sicken slowly over weeks or drop dead at the dinner table. Vatican records show regular payments to a mysterious figure known only as Master Dominic for special preparations for the papal table. When investigators later tried to trace these payments, they found that Master Dominic had himself died under suspicious circumstances in 1504. Cardinal Adriano Castellesi learned about Borgia hospitality the hard way. After opposing Alexander's plans to make Cesare a secular prince, he was invited to a private dinner with the Pope. He accepted despite warnings from friends, perhaps believing his rank would protect him. 3 days later, he was dead, his body showing the telltale signs of cantarella poisoning: convulsions, vomiting blood, and a distinctive smell of bitter almonds. But Castellesi was just one name on a very long list. Cardinal Giovanni Michiel died after questioning the Pope's financial practices. Bishop Francesco Troche collapsed during Mass after giving a sermon about clerical celibacy. Even foreign visitors weren't safe. The French ambassador's secretary died after reporting too enthusiastically about Vatican corruption to his home court. The Borgias didn't just kill their enemies, they made examples of them. Bodies were often displayed publicly, positioned to send messages to potential troublemakers. When the young Lord of Camerino objected to Cesare's seizure of his lands, he and his two brothers were strangled in their own castle. Their bodies were hung from the battlements with a sign reading, "Thus perish all enemies of the Borgia name." Even more chilling was how casual the violence became. Cesare reportedly kept a list of intended victims in his private study, updating it regularly like a household shopping list. Servants spoke of overhearing father and son discussing murders over breakfast, debating methods, and timing with the same tone others might use to plan a hunting trip. The papal apartments themselves became a crime scene. Secret passages allowed for discreet entrances and exits. Tapestries were repositioned to muffle screams. Even the papal dining room was redesigned with special tiles that could be easily cleaned of bloodstains. But perhaps most disturbing was how the church hierarchy adapted to this new reality. Cardinals began travelling with food tasters. Bishops wrote their wills before attending papal audiences. The College of Cardinals started conducting business in public spaces, afraid to meet privately where they might be more easily eliminated. By 1502, the fear had spread beyond Rome. Foreign courts advised their ambassadors to avoid private meetings with papal representatives. Trade with the Vatican required special precautions. Even other Catholic rulers began questioning whether Alexander VI was truly the vicar of Christ or something else entirely, something that wore the robes of holiness while serving a very different master. The murder spree reached its peak in the summer of 1503, when Cesare attempted to poison several cardinals simultaneously at a dinner party outside Rome. The plan was to eliminate the last significant opposition to Borgia control of the College of Cardinals, ensuring that the next pope would be a family ally or puppet. But in a twist that might have been divine justice, something went wrong. The poisoned wine was served to the wrong guests. Instead of killing their intended victims, the Borgias had poisoned themselves. Alexander VI drank deeply from the contaminated cup, consuming a dose of cantarella that would have killed an ox. Within hours he was writhing in agony, his body racked with convulsions as the poison did its work. The man who had turned the Vatican into a den of murder was dying from his own weapon, and even his most loyal servants couldn't help but see the hand of God in his suffering. But Alexander's death wouldn't end the Borgia legacy of violence. It would only transform it into something even more dangerous, a precedent that would haunt the Catholic Church for centuries to come. August 18th, 1503. Picture the most powerful man in Christendom writhing on silk sheets, soaked with his own vomit, blood, and liquid shit. His bloated face, already ravaged by years of syphilis, has turned a sickly yellow-green. His eyes, bloodshot and weeping pus, roll back in his skull as convulsions rack his diseased body. The stench coming from him is so overwhelming that even hardened servants flee the room, gagging. This is Alexander VI dying from his own poison, and the irony is so perfect, it seems orchestrated by God himself. The evening had started with such promise. Cardinal Adriano Corneto's villa outside Rome offered relief from the summer heat that had been baking the city like an oven. Alexander and Cesare arrived in good spirits, planning to eliminate several troublesome cardinals with their signature cantarella poison, a mercury-based compound that could kill silently and leave few traces, but in a twist that would be laughable if it weren't so horrific. Someone fucked up the wine service. The poisoned bottles, intended for their enemies, ended up on their own table. Cesare, young and paranoid, noticed something was wrong when his wine tasted bitter. He immediately began vomiting, purging most of the poison from his system. But Alexander, drunk on wine and power, had already drained his cup completely. The ride back to the Vatican was a nightmare. Alexander began sweating profusely, his papal robe sticking to his skin as his body temperature spiked. By the time they reached the papal apartments, he was shaking uncontrollably, and the telltale smell of bitter almonds was seeping from his pores. What happened next reveals the true character of the man who claimed to represent Christ on earth. As the cantarella began its work, Mercury slowly destroying his nervous system from the inside, Alexander didn't pray for forgiveness or call for last rites. He raged. He cursed God for abandoning him. He screamed at his physicians to save him, threatening to have them burned alive if they failed. The papal bedchamber became a torture chamber. Alexander's body betrayed him in the most humiliating ways possible. He shit himself repeatedly, liquid feces streaming down his legs as his bowel control disappeared. His skin began peeling off in chunks, leaving raw, weeping sores that reeked of infection. His fingernails turned black and began falling off one by one, littering the bed like macabre confetti. But the worst part was his mind. The mercury poisoning caused horrific hallucinations. Alexander would suddenly sit up, pointing at empty corners of the room, screaming at invisible figures. He held long conversations with people who weren't there, sometimes his dead son Juan, sometimes cardinals he'd murdered, sometimes figures that those present could only assume were demons. Lucrezia rushed to his bedside, but even she couldn't bear what she saw. Her father, the man who had used her body for his pleasure, who had made her pregnant with his own children, looked at her with wild, unfocused eyes and began confessing to acts so horrible that she fled the room in tears. Whatever he told her in those final moments was never repeated, but witnesses said she looked like someone who had stared directly into hell. The papal physicians tried everything. They bled him until the sheets were crimson. They forced him to drink emetics that made him vomit blood and bile. They applied heated irons to his skin, trying to burn the poison out of his system. Nothing worked. If anything, their treatment seemed to intensify his agony. As his condition deteriorated, Alexander's ravings became even more disturbing. He spoke to someone he kept calling Master, apparently reporting on his earthly activities like a subordinate giving a progress report. "I gave you their souls," he whispered to the empty air. "I delivered them as promised. The children, the priests, all of them corrupt now. The church is yours." Cardinal della Rovere arrived to administer last rites, but when he tried to hear Alexander's confession, the dying pope began laughing. Wild, hysterical laughter that echoed through the papal apartments, like the sound of madness itself. Between fits of cackling and screaming, Alexander gasped out fragments of what might have been a confession, but instead of repenting, he seemed to be bragging. You think this was sin?" he wheezed, blood bubbling from his lips. "This was liberation. I showed them what power really means. No more pretense, no more lies about holiness, just pure will." His final words, delivered while staring directly at Della Rovere, were perhaps the most chilling of all. "You fool, you think you've won? I'm not the first, and I won't be the last. The church is just a mask. Underneath, we're all the same, all hungry, all corrupt, all mine." Then, with a final convulsion that arched his back so violently it seemed his spine might snap, Alexander VI died. Not peacefully, not in a state of grace, but apparently delighted by the chaos he was leaving behind. But death didn't bring dignity to the corpse. Within hours, Alexander's body began decomposing at an alarming rate. His face swelled until it was unrecognizable. His skin turned black and began sloughing off in putrid chunks. The stench became so overwhelming that the papal apartments had to be abandoned. When they tried to dress the corpse for burial, his body had swollen so much that the papal vestments wouldn't fit. His tongue had turned black and protruded grotesquely from his mouth. Worst of all, as servants tried to position him in his coffin, his bowels released one final time, filling the sacred space with the reek of decay and excrement. It took 6 men to force his bloated corpse into the coffin, and even then, they couldn't close the lid properly. Alexander VI, the most perverted pope in history, was buried like a piece of rotting meat, his body too corrupted by poison and disease to maintain even the illusion of sanctity in death. The irony was perfect. A man who had spent his life poisoning others died from his own toxins, and even in death, his flesh bore witness to the corruption that had consumed his soul. If you thought Alexander's death would end the Borgia nightmare, you were wrong, because while the Pope lay dying in the Vatican, his son Cesare was already plotting a comeback that would make his father's crimes look like children's games. Cesare had survived the poisoning, but just barely. For weeks he lay in agony as the cantarella slowly worked its way out of his system. His skin peeled off in sheets, his hair fell out in clumps, his fingernails turned black and dropped off one by one. But his mind remained sharp, and his rage burned hotter than the fever that should have killed him. As soon as he could stand, Cesare began his campaign of revenge. The cardinals who had celebrated his father's death found themselves facing a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from their destruction. And unlike Alexander, who had at least maintained the pretense of papal dignity, Cesare operated with no constraints at all. His first target was Cardinal Giovanni Vera, who had made the mistake of publicly declaring that God had finally punished the Borgia family for their sins. Vera's body was found 3 days later in his private chapel, crucified upside down on his own altar. His tongue had been cut out and nailed to the chapel door, with a note reading, "Thus speak all enemies of the house of Borgia." But Cesare wasn't content with simple murder. He wanted to send a message that would terrorize his enemies into submission. So he began employing methods that were designed not just to kill, but to horrify. Cardinal Battista Orsini, who had opposed Borgia policies for years, was invited to what appeared to be a peace conference. He arrived at Cesare's villa outside Rome expecting negotiations. Instead, he was seized by masked men and dragged to the cellars, where Cesare was waiting with a collection of torture devices that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. What happened to Orsini over the next 3 days was so brutal that even hardened soldiers refused to speak about it afterward. Suffice it to say that when his body was finally discovered, it had been mutilated in ways that suggested the killer had intimate knowledge of both human anatomy and the darkest passages of Scripture. The positioning of the corpse was clearly meant to mock the crucifixion itself. Word of these atrocities spread quickly through Roman society, but instead of rallying opposition against Cesare, they achieved exactly what he intended: paralyzing fear. Cardinals began travelling with armed guards. Noble families barricaded themselves in their palaces. Even foreign ambassadors requested military escorts when conducting business in Rome. But Cesare's most audacious revenge was reserved for the College of Cardinals itself. He couldn't become pope. His reputation was too notorious, and he'd been released from his clerical vows anyway. But he could control who did become pope, and he planned to use that power to install a puppet who would allow him to rule the church from behind the scenes. The papal election of 1503 became a masterpiece of intimidation and bribery. Cesare's agents surrounded the Vatican with armed men, ostensibly for security, but actually to ensure that no cardinal left the conclave without his permission. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals found themselves voting under conditions that made Alexander's election look honest by comparison. Those who supported candidates Cesare opposed received graphic descriptions of what had happened to Cardinal Orsini. Those who needed additional persuasion were shown artifacts from his father's torture chamber, blood-stained implements with helpful explanations of their uses. And those few who still resisted found family members mysteriously disappearing, only to be returned with messages carved into their flesh. The cardinals elected Pius III, an elderly compromise candidate who they hoped would be too weak to threaten anyone. He died within a month, almost certainly poisoned, and the college was forced to convene again. This time, they elected Giuliano della Rovere as Julius II, the same man who had tried to give Alexander last rites and who swore to destroy the Borgia legacy forever. It was the worst possible outcome for Cesare, and it marked the beginning of his final downfall. But not before he would commit one last atrocity that would ensure the Borgia name lived on in infamy. Knowing that Julius II would move against him immediately, Cesare decided to eliminate the only witness who could definitively prove his involvement in the Vatican's darkest crimes: his own sister, Lucrezia. Lucrezia Borgia knew she was going to die. By late 1503, she'd become the most dangerous person in Europe, not because of any army she commanded or alliance she controlled, but because of what she knew. She'd been present for conversations no one else had witnessed. She had seen documents that could topple kingdoms. Most dangerously of all, she could testify to the truth about the Borgia family's most unspeakable secrets. And her brother Cesare couldn't afford to let her live. The cat-and-mouse game began subtly. Lucrezia, now married to Alfonso d'Este and living in Ferrara, started receiving gifts from her brother. Expensive wines that she dared not drink, jewellery that she had carefully examined for hidden poison needles, books with pages that had been treated with substances that could be absorbed through the skin. She knew the methods because she'd helped perfect them during her years in the Vatican. The Borgia family had educated her in more than just politics and diplomacy. They'd taught her the fine art of murder. But Lucrezia had advantages her brother didn't expect. Years of surviving in the papal court had made her paranoid in ways that saved her life. She employed food tasters, changed her sleeping arrangements nightly, and kept a collection of antidotes that would have impressed a professional apothecary. More importantly, she had prepared for this moment. Hidden throughout her apartments in Ferrara was evidence that could destroy not just Cesare, but the entire network of corruption that had grown up around the Borgia papacy. Letters in her father's handwriting describing murders in explicit detail. Financial records showing how church funds had been diverted to pay for assassinations. Most damaging of all, a diary she had kept throughout her years in the Vatican. A diary that contained secrets so explosive they could shatter the Catholic Church itself. Cesare's first assassination attempt came during Christmas Mass in 1503. A young priest recently assigned to Lucrezia's household approached her during communion with a consecrated host that had been treated with cantarella. But Lucrezia had been watching him carefully and noticed the telltale signs of nervous sweating that marked an inexperienced killer. She accepted the host, but didn't swallow it, instead palming it while pretending to pray. Later examination confirmed her suspicions. The communion wafer contained enough poison to kill a dozen people. The second attempt was more sophisticated. A craftsman arrived to repair a window in Lucrezia's bedroom, but instead of fixing the glass, he installed a mechanism that would release poisonous vapours when the window was opened. Lucrezia's security discovered the device only because one of her servants noticed an unusual smell and investigated. But it was the third attempt that nearly succeeded, and that revealed the true depths of Cesare's desperation. In January 1504, Lucrezia received word that her younger brother, Joffre, was dying and had requested to see her one last time. The message came with all the proper authentication, bearing seals and signatures that appeared genuine. Even her most paranoid advisors agreed that the request seemed legitimate. The trap was perfect. Joffre was indeed dying. Cesare had poisoned him to make the story credible. The location was a remote monastery where Cesare's men could operate freely, and the emotional appeal was calculated to override Lucrezia's usually careful judgment. She almost walked into it. Only a last-minute revelation from an unexpected source saved her life. One of the monks at the monastery, horrified by what he had witnessed there, managed to get a message to Ferrara warning that armed men were waiting in ambush. When Lucrezia's party arrived at the monastery, they found Joffre's body and evidence of the trap that had been set for her. But they also found something else, documents that Cesare had left behind in his haste to escape, papers that revealed the full scope of his revenge campaign and, more chillingly, his plans for the future of the Catholic Church. Cesare hadn't given up on controlling the papacy. He was planning to assassinate Julius II and several other senior cardinals, then use the chaos to install a puppet pope who would restore Borgia influence. The timeline called for the murders to begin during Easter services, when the victims would be gathered in St. Peter's Basilica and vulnerable to coordinated attacks. It was a plan so audacious and blasphemous that even Lucrezia, who had seen the worst of her family's crimes, was horrified. She realised that Cesare's ambitions had crossed the line from mere corruption into something that threatened the very foundation of Christian civilization. For the first time in her life, Lucrezia Borgia decided to fight back. She began reaching out to Julius II's allies, offering to trade her knowledge of Borgia crimes for protection from her brother's assassination attempts. The negotiations were delicate. Lucrezia needed to provide enough information to prove her value without revealing so much that she could be eliminated as a witness. But Julius II was more interested in her testimony than her death. He understood that Lucrezia represented his best chance to definitively expose the Borgia legacy and justify the harsh measures he was planning to take against Cesare. The meeting between the Pope and Alexander VI's daughter took place in secret, in a convent outside Rome, where both parties could feel relatively secure. What Lucrezia told Julius II during that encounter has never been fully recorded, but the Pope's reaction suggests it was even worse than his darkest suspicions. According to witnesses, Julius II emerged from the meeting looking like a man who had seen hell itself. He immediately ordered masses to be said for the purification of the Vatican and began planning what he called the Great Cleansing, a systematic effort to root out every trace of Borgia influence from the Catholic Church. But Cesare learned about the meeting before Julius could act on Lucrezia's revelations. His response was swift and terrible. If he couldn't kill his sister to keep her quiet, he would destroy her credibility by revealing the one secret that would make her testimony worthless. The secret of what had really happened between Lucrezia and her father during those long nights in the papal apartments. March 1504. Rome was buzzing with rumours that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The former Pope's daughter was preparing to testify before a tribunal of cardinals about crimes committed within the Vatican itself. But as the date approached, a different kind of whisper began circulating through the city's taverns and palaces. Whispers about revelations that might be too shocking for even the hardened cynics of Renaissance Rome to bear. Cesare Borgia had made good on his threat. If he couldn't silence Lucrezia, he would destroy her credibility by revealing the full truth about the Borgia family's most shameful secret. And he had the evidence to prove it. The documents Cesare released to selected enemies of Julius II painted a picture so disturbing that many of those who read them initially refused to believe their contents. Letters in Alexander VI's handwriting that described his relationship with Lucrezia in terms that no father should ever use about his daughter. Witness statements from Vatican servants who claimed to have seen the Pope and Lucrezia together in compromising positions. Most damning of all, medical records that seemed to confirm Lucrezia had given birth to children whose conception coincided with periods when she was residing primarily in the papal apartments. But Cesare had made a critical miscalculation. Instead of discrediting Lucrezia, the revelations only made the case against the Borgia papacy more compelling. If Alexander VI had indeed committed incest with his own daughter, it meant that the corruption of the Vatican ran even deeper than anyone had imagined. Julius II's response was swift and decisive. Rather than abandoning the investigation, he expanded it. Rather than dismissing Lucrezia as a compromised witness, he brought her under papal protection and encouraged her to tell the complete truth about her family's crimes. The trial that followed was conducted in secret, but enough details leaked out to shock Europe. Lucrezia's testimony, delivered over 3 days of intense questioning, reportedly included confessions that left hardened cardinals weeping and praying for their own souls. She confirmed that her father had indeed violated his vows of celibacy, but not just with anonymous mistresses. Alexander VI had treated the papal apartments as his personal brothel, with a regular rotation of women who were expected to service him and his guests. Cardinals who wanted papal favour were encouraged to offer their own female relatives as tribute. The entertainments described by Burchard had been regular occurrences, not isolated incidents, but the most devastating testimony concerned the children. Lucrezia admitted that at least 2 of the babies attributed to her mysterious love affairs had actually been fathered by Alexander VI himself. The Roman infant and a daughter who died in infancy were the products of a sexual relationship that had begun when Lucrezia was barely 15 years old. She described how Alexander had gradually groomed her, starting with inappropriate affection and escalating to full sexual abuse. She spoke of being trapped in the Vatican, unable to escape or resist, because any attempt to do so would have meant not just her own death, but the destruction of her other family members. Perhaps most chilling of all, Lucrezia revealed that the incestuous relationship hadn't been hidden from Cesare or her other brothers. They had known what was happening and had used it as leverage in their own negotiations with their father. In the Borgia family, even the most sacred bonds had been prostituted for political advantage. The tribunal that heard Lucrezia's testimony was composed of some of the most senior church officials in Europe, men who had thought themselves beyond shock after decades of exposure to Vatican politics. Yet several of them reportedly required medical attention after listening to her complete account. Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, later Pope Leo X, was said to have fainted when Lucrezia described a ceremony where Alexander had forced her to participate in what he called a papal blessing, that was actually a blasphemous parody of religious ritual combined with sexual abuse. More evidence emerged from other sources. Former Vatican servants, emboldened by Julius II's promise of protection, came forward with their own accounts of what they had witnessed during the Borgia years. Palace guards described being ordered to stand watch while private masses were conducted in the papal bedchamber. Kitchen staff told of preparing aphrodisiac-laced meals for father-daughter dinners. Even members of the papal choir revealed that they had been required to sing sacred music during orgies as a form of blasphemous accompaniment. The accumulated evidence painted a concept of systematic sacrilege that went far beyond mere corruption. Alexander VI had turned the Vatican into a stage for the violation of every sacred principle of Christianity, using his position as Pope to commit sins that would have horrified the pagans of ancient Rome. But perhaps the most damning revelation was yet to come. Among the documents recovered from the papal apartments was Alexander's private theological journal, a collection of writings that suggested His corruption wasn't the result of weakness or temptation, but of a deliberate rejection of Christian doctrine itself. In entry after entry, Alexander had recorded his growing conviction that traditional Christianity was a fraud designed to control the masses. He wrote about his discovery of what he called the true path to power, which involved embracing sin rather than avoiding it. Most blasphemously, he described his role as Pope not as serving God, but as serving God's adversary. The journal contained prayers, if they could be called that, addressed not to Christ or the Virgin Mary, but to the fallen angel himself. Alexander had apparently conducted private rituals in the papal apartments that were designed to invoke diabolic rather than divine power. The ceremonies involving Lucrezia, according to his own accounts, were part of these blasphemous rites. When Julius II read Alexander's journal, he reportedly locked himself in private prayer for 3 days, emerging only to order that every trace of Borgia influence be purged from the Vatican. Rooms were blessed and reconsecrated, furniture was burned, even the papal throne was replaced, deemed too contaminated by Alexander's presence to ever be used again. But the damage to the Catholic Church's reputation was already spreading beyond Rome. Word of the tribunal's findings leaked to Protestant reformers, who used the revelations as proof that the Catholic Church had become an instrument of Satan rather than God. The scandal provided ammunition for religious wars that would rage across Europe for generations. And through it all, Cesare Borgia remained at large, protected by foreign allies who valued his military skills more than they condemned his moral failures. He had lost his bid to control the papacy, but he had succeeded in something perhaps more significant. He had demonstrated that even the holiest institutions could be corrupted beyond redemption. The age of papal authority based on moral legitimacy was ending. In its place would come a more cynical era, where religious leaders would be judged not by their sanctity, but by their effectiveness in protecting church interests. Alexander VI had not just perverted the papacy, he had transformed it permanently. Julius II thought he could cleanse the Vatican. He was wrong. As the new pope worked frantically to restore dignity to the papal office, he discovered that Alexander VI's corruption had metastasized far beyond what anyone had imagined. The Borgia network of bribery, blackmail and murder had infected every level of the church hierarchy, creating a system so entrenched that removing it would require destroying the institution itself. The problem became clear during Julius's first attempts at reform. When he tried to remove cardinals who had bought their positions during Alexander's reign, he faced open rebellion. These men had invested fortunes in their offices and weren't about to surrender them for the sake of moral purity. When Julius threatened excommunication, they simply threatened him back, with evidence of his own compromises and deals made during the Borgia years. Because that was Alexander's true genius, he hadn't just corrupted himself, he had made corruption a requirement for survival in his Vatican. Anyone who wanted to maintain their position had been forced to participate in or enable his crimes. By the end of his reign, there was virtually no one in the church hierarchy who had clean hands. The cardinals who had opposed Alexander most vocally were often the ones with the most to hide. Cardinal della Rovere himself, now Julius II, had made deals with the Borgias to protect his own interests. Cardinal Ascanio Sforza had taken Borgia gold and looked the other way during murders. Even the most supposedly virtuous church leaders had been compromised through a web of financial obligations and political necessities. Julius quickly realized that attempting to remove everyone who had been tainted by Alexander's influence would leave him with no functioning government at all. So he made a pragmatic decision that would haunt the church for centuries. He decided to manage the corruption rather than eliminate it. the new pope established what he called protocols of discretion, essentially rules for how church officials could engage in morally questionable activities without creating scandals. Celibacy would be publicly maintained but privately ignored. Financial corruption would continue but be better hidden. Murder would be discouraged but not absolutely forbidden in cases involving church security. It was institutionalized hypocrisy, and it worked. The scandals stopped making headlines, not because they stopped happening, but because they were better managed. The church maintained its public image, while continuing many of the practices that Alexander had pioneered. But the real legacy of the Borgia papacy wasn't institutional, it was psychological. Alexander VI had shattered the assumption that religious authority was necessarily connected to moral authority. He had demonstrated that the Pope could be a criminal, a heretic, and a monster, and the Church would continue to function. This revelation spread far beyond the Vatican walls. If the supposed representative of God on earth could be so thoroughly evil, what did that say about divine justice? About the validity of religious law? About the entire structure of Christian civilization? Protestant reformers seized on these questions with devastating effect. Martin Luther's 95 Theses, posted just 14 years after Alexander's death, explicitly referenced the Borgia scandals as evidence that the Catholic Church had become Satan's instrument on earth. The corruption that Alexander had normalized provided intellectual ammunition for a religious revolution that would split Christianity permanently. But perhaps more significant was the effect on Catholic believers themselves. The generation that came of age during and after Alexander's reign had witnessed the complete separation of religious office from religious faith. They learned to practice Christianity while harbouring deep cynicism about Christian institutions. This produced a peculiar form of religiosity that would characterise Catholicism for centuries: intense personal devotion combined with acceptance of institutional corruption. Catholics would continue to attend Mass, receive sacraments, and follow church teachings while simultaneously expecting their priests to be criminals and their pope to be a politician. The psychological impact extended beyond religion into politics and social structures. If the most sacred institutions could be so thoroughly corrupted, then corruption itself became normalized. Renaissance Italy saw an explosion of political cynicism that made Machiavelli's The Prince seem like moderate political theory. Alexander's influence can be traced through the generations that followed. His illegitimate children established noble houses that would rule parts of Italy for centuries, carrying forward the Borgia approach to power, the belief that authority existed to be exploited, that moral constraints were obstacles to be overcome, and that the only real sin was weakness. Cesare Borgia's career as a military commander and political manipulator provided the template for a new kind of ruler, one who combined religious legitimacy with complete moral flexibility. This model would influence everyone from the Medici popes to the monarchs of Spain and France. Even the physical transformation of Rome reflected Alexander's legacy. The city he left behind was beautiful, but hollow, filled with magnificent churches built with blood money and palaces constructed by slaves. The artistic patronage of the Renaissance papacy, including Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel, was funded largely through the sale of indulgences and the profits from crimes that Alexander had normalized. Visitors to modern Vatican City walk through spaces that were designed and decorated during the decades following Alexander's death, when church leaders were desperately trying to create beauty magnificent enough to distract from the moral ugliness they couldn't eliminate. The splendour of St. Peter's Basilica and the Sistine Chapel represents not just artistic achievement, but also a massive exercise in historical laundering. The true measure of Alexander's impact isn't found in history books, it's in the assumptions we still make about religious and political power. The expectation that leaders will be hypocrites, that institutions will serve their own interests rather than their stated missions, that idealism is naive and cynicism is realistic. All of these attitudes can be traced back to the precedent Alexander VI established. He didn't just corrupt the papacy, he corrupted the entire concept of legitimate authority. And that corruption proved to be remarkably durable, surviving reform movements, revolutions, and enlightenments that were supposed to cleanse it from human institutions. The most perverted pope in history had achieved a kind of immortality, not through sanctity, but through the permanent transformation of how power relates to morality in human society. Today, more than 500 years after Alexander VI drank his final cup of poisoned wine, his ghost still haunts the Vatican. Not literally, though some of the Swiss guards swear they've seen strange figures walking the corridors late at night, but in ways far more profound and disturbing than any supernatural manifestation could ever be. The institutional changes Alexander wrought didn't die with him. They became part of the Church's DNA, embedded so deeply in its structures and assumptions that they're virtually impossible to remove. Modern papal scandals don't shock us the way they should, because Alexander VI established the precedent that religious authority and moral authority are entirely separate things. Consider how the Catholic Church has handled the modern crisis of sexual abuse by clergy. The patterns are unmistakably Borgian, prioritizing institutional protection over victim welfare, using wealth and political influence to suppress scandals and maintaining public facades of moral authority while enabling private criminality. These aren't new strategies, they're refinements of methods Alexander VI pioneered over half a millennium ago. The cover-up techniques that modern church officials employ would have been familiar to any cardinal serving under Alexander. Document destruction, witness intimidation, financial settlements tied to silence agreements, the transfer of problematic clergy to new positions where they can continue their activities. All of these approaches were standard practice in the Borgia Vatican. Even the theological justifications echo across the centuries. Just as Alexander argued that divine forgiveness made earthly sins irrelevant for church leaders, modern church officials have claimed that the sacrament of confession absolves priests of the need to face secular justice. The same twisted logic that allowed a pope to commit incest and murder continues to shield predators wearing clerical collars. But Alexander's influence extends far beyond the Catholic Church. He established templates for institutional corruption that have been adopted by governments, corporations, and organizations worldwide. The idea that leaders operate by different moral standards than those they lead, that public virtue and private vice can coexist indefinitely, that power ultimately justifies itself. These are Borgian principles disguised as modern realpolitik. Look at any contemporary political scandal and you'll find Alexander's fingerprints. The politician who campaigns on family values while maintaining multiple mistresses, the corporate executive who preaches social responsibility while poisoning communities for profit, the religious leader who demands moral purity from followers while living in luxury purchased with their donations. These aren't aberrations, they're applications of the Borgia playbook. The normalization of hypocrisy that Alexander achieved has become one of the defining characteristics of modern civilization. We expect our leaders to lie, our institutions to serve themselves rather than their stated missions, and our moral authorities to be secretly immoral. This expectation has become so embedded in our culture that we're more suspicious of leaders who appear genuinely virtuous than we are of those who are obviously corrupt. Alexander also pioneered the use of spectacle to distract from substance, another technique that feels remarkably contemporary. His elaborate ceremonies, magnificent art patronage, and theatrical displays of piety serve to divert attention from his crimes. Modern leaders employ the same strategy, using media manipulation, symbolic gestures, and carefully choreographed public events to maintain legitimacy while engaging in activities that would destroy them if fully exposed. The Borgia family's approach to succession planning has also proved enduring. The idea that power should be inherited rather than earned, that family loyalty trumps institutional responsibility, and that nepotism is a legitimate governance strategy. These principles continue to shape everything from corporate boardrooms to political dynasties. Even our understanding of evil has been influenced by Alexander's legacy. Before the Borgias, European culture generally assumed that great evil was accompanied by obvious signs of moral corruption. The devil was supposed to look frightening, act menacingly, and clearly identify himself as an enemy of good. Alexander demonstrated that ultimate evil could wear beautiful clothing, speak eloquently about virtue, and maintain the appearance of sanctity while committing the most depraved acts imaginable. This revelation fundamentally changed how humans think about moral danger. The most dangerous predators don't announce themselves. They disguise themselves as protectors. The greatest institutional threats come not from obvious enemies, but from corrupted allies. The most effective way to destroy an organization is not to attack it from outside, but to rot it from within. These insights have become so commonplace that we take them for granted, but they represent a profound shift in human understanding that can be traced directly to the Borgia experience. Medieval people believed that good and evil were clearly distinguishable, and that God would never allow his representatives to become agents of Satan. Alexander VI shattered those assumptions permanently. The psychological impact of this revelation continues to reverberate through human culture. We live in a world where trust must be constantly verified, where authority must be perpetually questioned, and where the gap between public image and private reality is assumed to be enormous. This is the world Alexander VI created, a world where cynicism is considered wisdom and naivety is considered dangerous. Perhaps most disturbingly, Alexander's legacy includes the normalization of escalating depravity. Each generation of leaders influenced by his example has pushed boundaries further, secure in the knowledge that precedent exists for even their worst behaviours. The incremental degradation of institutional morality that he initiated has continued for 5 centuries, creating a civilization where previously unthinkable corruption is routinely accepted as just how things work. Yet for all the darkness of his legacy, Alexander VI also revealed something important about human resilience. The Church survived him. Christianity continued despite his blasphemies. Human beings proved capable of maintaining their faith and moral convictions, even when their institutions failed them completely. The question that haunts us today is whether we've learned anything from his example, or whether we're doomed to repeat it in new forms, with new technologies, but the same fundamental corruption of the relationship between power and responsibility. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the darkest corners of Vatican history. As you lay there in the quiet darkness, maybe feeling that comfortable drowsiness starting to settle in, you might think you can simply forget what you've heard tonight. That these are just old stories, ancient scandals, tales from a time so different from ours that they have no relevance to the world you wake up to tomorrow. But you can't unknow what Alexander VI taught us. You can't unsee what the Borgia family revealed about the relationship between power and corruption. And you can't unhear the whisper that echoes through every institution, every authority figure, every person who claims the right to rule over others. The whisper that says, moral constraints are for other people, that power ultimately answers only to itself, and that the appearance of virtue is more valuable than virtue itself. Alexander VI died over 500 years ago, but his ghost haunts every newsroom, every corporate boardroom, every political campaign, and yes, every church sanctuary where leaders preach values they don't practice. He established the template for institutional hypocrisy that we still live with today. The next time you see a politician caught in a scandal, remember Alexander's midnight orgies in the Vatican. When you read about corporate executives poisoning communities while preaching environmental responsibility, think of the Pope who poisoned cardinals while blessing the faithful. When religious leaders fall from grace in spectacular fashion, recall that the precedent was set by a man who turned the holiest office in Christendom into a criminal enterprise. But perhaps most importantly, remember that Alexander VI's true victory wasn't in the crimes he committed. It was in making us expect such crimes from our leaders. He normalized corruption so thoroughly that we're surprised when authorities actually live up to their stated principles, rather than shocked when they betray them. The most perverted pope in history didn't just pervert his own office, he perverted our understanding of what leadership can and should be. He whispered in humanity's ear that power inevitably corrupts, that moral authority is always a facade, and that those who rule us are fundamentally different from and superior to those they rule. That whisper has never stopped. It echoes through every era, every culture, every system of government that's been tried since Alexander drank his final cup of wine. It's the voice that tells us not to expect too much from our leaders, not to demand too much from our institutions, and not to believe too deeply in the possibility of genuine moral authority. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you might hear it too, that soft, persuasive voice suggesting that this is just how the world works, that corruption is inevitable, that the powerful have always preyed on the powerless and always will. It's the voice of Alexander VI, still working to corrupt our expectations 5 centuries after his death. But remember this, every time someone refuses to accept that corruption is inevitable, every time an institution chooses transparency over secrecy, every time a leader actually serves those they're supposed to represent rather than themselves, that's a small victory over Alexander's legacy. The most perverted pope in history may have poisoned the wells of human trust, but he didn't poison them permanently. We can still choose to demand better. We can still insist that power should serve purpose higher than its own perpetuation. We can still believe that moral authority should actually be moral. The choice is ours. The same choice that faced every generation since Alexander VI walked the halls of the Vatican. Whether to accept corruption as normal, or to remember that it was once so shocking that an entire city celebrated when the corrupted leader finally died. Sleep well. But don't forget, because in a world where Alexander VI's example still echoes, forgetting is the most dangerous thing we can do. Sweet dreams. And remember, the most important battles aren't fought with armies or weapons. They're fought with expectations, with demands for decency, and with the simple but radical insistence that those who claim authority over us should actually deserve it. The ghost of Alexander VI is counting on us to give up that fight. Let's prove him wrong.